Good day, everybody. This is Giancarlo Chieri from the state team. It's 3 o'clock sharp. I think we are ready to go. I would like to, first of all, warmly welcome all of you who joined us today for this webinar. We have more than close to 400 people registered and 70 countries online. That's an amazing result. In today's webinar, we've asked our distinguished speakers to give us their insight, their analysis, their critical top tips from a leadership point of view on the extensively debated topic of joint needs assessment and how to go about it. But before introducing the speakers and the topic a little bit further, I would like to say a few words about the webinar. First of all, the webinar would last 60 minutes. During the first 30 minutes, I will be asking questions to our speakers, and they will be providing us their reflection to introduce the topic. During the second 30 minutes, I will be taking your question that I will direct to the speakers. Allow me now to provide some technical guidance. Please follow the following ground rules for this webinar. The audience should stay on mute through the course of this webinar. Please have your camera turned off at all times during the webinar. You can use the chat box on the right-hand side of your WebEx window to communicate with everyone. Please note it's with everyone on this webinar. If you have questions for the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side, just below the chat box. Also, please note that we will be running 2 polls during the course of this webinar. Your response is valuable in delivering better on our future webinars, so thanks in advance. If you have any issues connecting to this webinar, please contact Venkatesh Naik with chat. Alternatively, you can watch a non-interactive feed on YouTube. We will be recording this webinar, and an edited version will be uploaded onto YouTube. You can find other useful webinars recording on the state website or YouTube channel. Let me now introduce the panelists. I must say that we are really thrilled to have with us Peter de Klerk, Deputy SRSG and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Somalia, and John Ging, Director of Operations in OCHA. A warm welcome to both of you, Peter and John. So we have gathered today to look into what can be done at field level to best contribute to strengthening the evidence base used for strategic decision-making by humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams. What are the practical steps HCs and HCTs need to take from a leadership perspective to ensure that humanitarian operations are based on the impartial, unbiased, comprehensive, context-sensitive, timely, and up-to-date information that is collected and, most important, analyzed in a transparent and collaborative manner. Similarly, we would like to touch on commitments of the Grand Bargain in relation to improved coordinated and impartial needs assessment, and more specifically, what does the commitment mean for HCs and HCT members? So, dear John, I would like now to open the first part of our conversation in asking you a first question. Within our current post-World Humanitarian Summit context, and considering that the joint needs assessment topic is one of the 10 Grand Bargain stream, I think there is a need to better define what joint need assessment is all about, what does it mean for operation at field level, and why is it important?
Thank you very much, Gianluca, and greetings to all colleagues across the world. This is indeed an incredibly important topic, and it was hugely debated in the context of the discussions around the Grand Bargain. If people recall, that was 15 humanitarian organizations and 15 of the leading financial donors coming together in advance of the World Humanitarian Summit to make some strong commitments to do better together going forward. And the Grand Bargain is what it said. It meant that donors had to change their practices, and it also meant that humanitarian organizations had to do change on their side, all in the interest of being more effective for the people that we exist to serve. When it comes to the topic of needs assessments, a lot of effort has been invested over the years, but it was felt on both the donor side and on the humanitarian organization side that we really needed to streamline and become much more effective in this area. I think the two key points are credibility of the assessments, so that everybody would rely on them as very strong evidence-based assessments of the situation. And secondly, the proliferation of many different assessments was discrediting us in the face of the affected populations who were just being asked too many times the same question. So in the end, the two key points here are to be more credible with better data, and secondly, less intrusive on the affected population. Just to briefly say that in defining what joint needs assessment is all about, it is about making a commitment to produce a single authoritative statement of the affected people's needs. I mean, that's the ultimate outcome. Now, that does not mean that there won't be many different assessments conducted. Multiple assessments are fine, but they have to be conducted in a complementary and a harmonized way. And the data that is collected by the different assessments has to be interoperable. So there has to be a shared methodology, a transparency, and so forth. In the end, what we're looking at in terms of the major change is that we will have a single methodological approach that enjoys everybody's confidence that that is empirically sound, that the evidence can be relied on, that the data is usable across the various sectors, and that we are transparent. We are sharing core data, whatever we have, because again, when we do the analysis, and this is very, very important, the analysis to be credible must be based on reliable data. And therefore, our financial donors in particular were very insistent that they want to see the source data so that they too can draw the same conclusions as we have drawn. Remember, this isn't about making some subjective analysis. This is about making an objective analysis of the needs. So ultimately, the grand bargain, and I quote, it commits us to provide a single, comprehensive, cross-sectoral, methodologically sound, and impartial overall assessment of the need for each crisis. So while we will have many different sources of data to achieve that, we will have that one single overview, and that is the distinction between analysis, which should be a unified analysis, and having many sources of data that will underpin that single analysis. But everybody is insisting now that if you speak about the humanitarian situation in any particular country, there should be a single, joined up, comprehensive, cross-sectorial analysis of the needs of the population, which we, irrespective of what our program interest might be or our program platform might be, that we can stand over as a community that analysis of the need. Thank you very much, Gianluca.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay, Giancarlo.
I'm back. Thanks a lot, John. This is very enlightening, and I really like, stressing the fact that we need, at the end of the day, we need an analysis, and a sound one, that is reflecting the needs of the affected population. Before I go on to the second question, I would like to remind the audience that there is this Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen where you can place your questions that we will be directing to John and Peter. Now, if I may, John, I would like to ask you a second question, and again, it's a bit of a big picture question for you. During the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, there was a lot of discussion, heated discussions at the time, we have to acknowledge that fact, about the need to have independent joint needs assessments performed by specialized organizations with no responsibility on the implementation of the response. What is the final agreement on this?
The final agreement, Giancarlo, is that we have to together, collectively, find the most credible and effective way to come up with the most accurate data. Yes, indeed, as you said, there were lots of debates about whether those conducting assessments would be driven by their program interest. So there was suggestion that assessments should be conducted independent of program organizations. But and again, the reasoning behind that suggestion, that proposal, was that there was a concern about whether program organizations could uphold the objectivity standard and not be influenced by their own programmatic interest in terms of the focus or the emphasis in the assessment data or the outcome in terms of the analysis. However, with that challenge presented to program organizations that they had to step up and prove their capacity to be objective in the conduct of these assessments, I'm very pleased to say that a good formula was found whereby yes, there was an acknowledgement that program organizations are well capable of being objective. They have a unique capacity and a unique insight to the situation where they are working. So to exclude them would just not make any rational sense. At the same time, we have to together address the objectivity challenge, that we are not being unduly influenced by our program interests in conducting these data collection exercises. And in the end, there was a nice formula found where there was also suggestion to incorporate some specialist capacity into the clusters conducting the assessments, and this was very much building on best practice that you will see in many places. Like currently we have REACH, which is a needs assessment focused NGO consortium, which does multi-sectoral assessments in places like Ukraine and Somalia. There is ACAPS, which also supports secondary data analysis in Nepal and elsewhere. And then there are other configurations in terms of, bringing in more specialist capacity, which has, of course, independence of programming, and does enhance the credibility of these assessments from that point of view of being able to show objectivity and so forth. The last thing I would say is that we have the example, of course, of the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the IPC as it's well known. And that's another very interesting example of how different organizations come together with government partners in that case to analyze existing data and to come to a consensus on the food security situation. That's an approach that has been so far limited to the food security sector, but it does also offer us some lessons for broader multi-sectoral consensus building around needs, with the built-in checks and balances to avoid sectoral or agency bias or the perceptions of bias, because in the end this is about credibility. So I think that we have a lot here to build on, and we have a sensible approach. We know the challenge that has been presented to organizations is prove that this data first and foremost is sound, prove in your methodology that you have reached the representative sample of the communities that have been affected. Prove that you have covered the spectrum of the needs and that you haven't been biased in just one sector or another. And then show in a transparent way that the data that you are gathering from whatever sector it's being gathered in is compatible with the methodology and the data that is being gathered in the other sectors, and that we have minimized the intrusion on the affected populations. Because, frankly speaking, I mean, the indignity is both in the circumstances that people find themselves in, but also in the multiple visits of people who come not with assistance but with clipboards to assess the situation. And this becomes very, very frustrating for affected populations very quickly. They expect when people come, they will come with aid, not with assessments and clipboards and so forth. So we have to minimize that intrusion by maximizing the impact of the engagement. Whenever we engage with people, we have to get the maximum out of that engagement so that then we can actually mobilize what this is all about, which is the response. Back to you, Giancarlo.
Thanks, John. Once again, very thoughtful, and for sure, it's good to remember that ultimately we need at one point to deliver aid, and the better we do, the better it is for the affected population. And it's true that an Excel spreadsheet is not always very useful in that regard. I like the credibility, the need for credibility, the need for trust, and this comes with transparency and impartiality. I like when you say that there is a collective endeavor around assessing the needs and analyzing them, and the checks and balance, of course, that we need to perform. Dear Peter, most welcome to you. And many thanks for dedicating your time for this webinar. We all know how busy you are, especially these days where you have quite a situation at hand in Somalia. So thanks again for being with us. I would like to ask you a question that will kind of allow us to land at more at field level and get a first-hand insight at operation level. Many consider that Somalia is producing in a regular manner a state-of-the-art assessment. It's really a Rolls-Royce you have down there. But as humanitarian coordinators, what are the leadership steps you took to put in place joint needs assessment? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Well, in a few words, of course, we need to start with a common agreement on what the information needs are. What do we need to know? And we have a very sophisticated system in terms of food security and nutrition analysis in the FSNAU. But on the non-food side in particular, we need to have also a very clear common agreement up front. Secondly, it's very important for us to also have a recognition of how versatile, flexible the situation is, and therefore the mechanisms also have to be that we apply. So we have a variety of actors, capacities, of course, geographically also there are major differences. Thirdly, what's very important is that there's a very strong communication between the humanitarian coordinator and the intercluster coordination group, which is a key tool that we use. And that the intercluster coordination group also uses mechanisms that are simple and usable and not too academic. And that is that's taken us some time to get there, and I'll get to that in a moment. Very close working relationship between the humanitarian coordinator and OCHA, which is not a given always, particularly in terms of the fact that I'm a triple hat and As you know, that means juggling a lot of balls, and in an environment where still there are great sensitivities around the whole issue of humanitarian imperative, and where there is a major anti-insurgency war going on. This is quite complicated, but we have been able to do that quite well in this case. We also have full humanitarian liaison capacity as part of my integrated office that guarantees that humanitarian issues and humanitarian assessment stays very much in focus in the work that I do. Confidence in the intercluster coordination group to identify process and resources, very important. This means that we can delegate the actual mechanics, the operational part of it, to the ICCG, which then means that the Humanitarian Country Team can actually concentrate on the more strategic questions. To go to the leadership actually more at the intercluster level, again, this is where OCHA leadership is absolutely key. There are no turf wars here between clusters, agencies, and OCHA in Somalia. That's taken a while, but we've gotten there by rallying around a number of clear, defined, and agreed upon tools. The critical role of the REACH project that John already mentioned, they're working through the clusters to make sure we standardize also our data. Then, of course, we have the latest tool. I'm not sure I would call it a Rolls-Royce, maybe a four-wheel drive VX Toyota. We've used, of course, before other mechanisms, one called MIRA, which is very complex, again, very, very sophisticated, but just simply took too long, was too complex, and it wasn't really appropriate for the evolving and sometimes very long-term humanitarian situations in which we find ourselves. So what we have now, the CERNA, is a comprehensive but simple tool that is immediately applicable both to new situations and to ongoing situations. And of course, very close to the working relationship between the Humanitarian Country Team and the ICCG is key. We have a joint HCT-ICCG meeting every 2 months. And again, I mentioned before, the HCT remains at the strategic and oversight level. So going on to the third element, which is the leadership at the cluster level. First of all, cluster lead agency, the role is absolutely key in terms of the implementation. That's why I need to have, as a humanitarian coordinator, a very strong, also bilateral role to cluster leads. And that is the way to, indeed, where necessary, steer the process if there are tensions between clusters, and that can come up, certainly. We, for instance, have around the drought situation that we're going through at the moment, some tension between agencies that are still very much pushing on the line of resilience, so basically keeping people's livelihoods intact against life saving. So sometimes that requires also a direct involvement of the humanitarian coordinator with the cluster lead agencies. Increasingly, we are moving to, of course, a regional level. Also, the country is being federalized, and we have strong federal member states that do interact with the humanitarian actors on the ground. So we work at subnational levels, and there are therefore the regional ICCGs also being created that therefore have more of a grip on the situation locally and regionally. Thirdly, cluster level initial analysis. So that means that we have the capacity at the cluster level, at the sectoral level, and that ultimately then filters its way up to the ICCG. But already a lot of the analysis is done at the cluster level. And then information management obviously there as well at the cluster level. Again, moving on to the next point, which is the other critical elements in the process to provide credible information. And there, first of all, of course, we are using mobile data collection, particularly in terms of the access and logistical constraints that we find ourselves in, not in the least because of the security issues, but also simply to get from A to B. So examples, we've particularly used this in shelter and wash most recently. And this information, of course, is then being put at the repository level, still very much in Nairobi. That's still one of our handicaps somehow. national capacities. We see stronger national and federal institutions coming up. Well, against 2011, when we had the last famine, of course, we now have major counterparts to work with, and that's fairly new, but it gives a new dynamic also, because whereas John, of course, has mentioned the importance of reliable data leading to the same conclusion between humanitarian actors and donors, also it's very important that government counterparts, both at the federal and at the regional level, tie into this as well. And I mentioned already the systematic collaboration, state level disaster management authorities. They're different in strength. The newer federal member states obviously are weaker. The older federal member states have quite an advanced system in place, such as Puntland and Somaliland. We see also higher consistency now between regional, national, and international levels, which gives us a higher credibility of resource mobilization. So basically, joint needs assessments are being done with regional and federal authorities. That means that we have one appeal, which is the Humanitarian Response Plan, which is not challenged by either local authorities or federal authorities. Over to you, Giancarlo.
Many thanks, Peter. That was really, really enlightening, and thanks for being that clear on the required leadership at each level, from you as an HC and juggling with a couple of other hats, to the HCT, to the ICCG, and to end up at field level. We really get clearly the sense that Somalia is an incredibly complex context, and many factors are to be considered. I would like to move to a second question for you, Peter. You touched on a couple of those obstacles you faced and tensions, as you mentioned, but could you please a bit elaborate on what those obstacles are and how you managed to overcome them?
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. I've categorized them in 4 categories, but could have been many more, so this is just like a snapshot. First of all, it's important for everybody to rally around a common vision, and I already mentioned that there can be tensions, even in terms of humanitarian needs assessment, when it comes to the difference between resilience and life-saving. And we do have that right now, this discussion going on. And it's not an either-or, of course, but still, it provides a certain tension field. Important also, common vision, having the authorities buy in, because if you get a challenge between your assessment and the way the authorities look at a major humanitarian disaster, this could be a major impediment to proper formulation of the response and implementation of the response. And then we've seen in the past actually that the HCT dynamics, the friction, has led to a paralysis in the past, and we've made a lot of progress in that respect, because in terms of steps taken to overcome the challenges, there's the rallying around a number of agreed upon methodologies, needs assessment. We're much more mature HCT than we were in the 2010-2011 period when the last famine hit us. We're facing the challenges together, one assessment, one coordinated response, one coordinated approach. And I already mentioned this tension with the authorities. We have, I think, increasingly managed to diffuse that. Access and security, I don't have to explain the still very strong presence of Al-Shabaab moving freely, particularly into South Central, and clearly affecting our access and our logistics. Not only Al-Shabaab, however, also significant bureaucratic impediments by regional local authorities also prevent penetration into major operational areas and proper needs assessment. So that's equally important for implementation as for the actual needs assessment and planning. And then, of course, in terms of access and security, we would be amiss if we did not also mention the whole issue of the physical staff security for people to go in and do assessments, particularly international staff. It's a very expensive, very complex, very resource-heavy exercise. We have mitigated this to the use of mobile technology, satellite technology, and of course I mentioned before the decentralization of some of our needs assessments and operations indeed by delegating to sub-regional ICCGs. And then of course the strength of local NGOs, local partners and local organizations have also been major contributors to a much stronger needs assessment deep into the field. National capacity, we have made strides, but it's still very, very unequal in terms of providing support to national entities. In particular, in Somaliland, we have a particular problem because we've moved away from humanitarian after a relative period of stability. So we have to like rejig the system whereby we're going back to a more humanitarian mode. Now that we have a major humanitarian disaster, i.e. the famine, right on our doorstep, that has implications for the way we work together with our partners in terms of the needs assessment. And again, the mitigating measures in that sense, I don't have to go into detail, they follow logically from what I just said. The last point is an interesting one, and that's one that John also brought up, which is assessment fatigue. You can only ask a question so many times, and you can only go to a community so many times. And there is a major credibility gap and cooperation gap, I would even say, that develops with the local communities and authorities if you don't immediately follow your needs assessment with delivery. You have to get it right. You can't repeat your assessment several times again. That's a major way of undermining your own credibility and your cooperation. And then, we have to also be careful that we do not confuse analysis tools with monitoring tools with actual assessment tools. We have the FSNAU, the Food Security and Nutrition Assessment Unit, which provides good assessment and monitoring, I would say monitoring, but it doesn't immediately translate into a concrete assessment of what needs to be done in an area. So we need to, whereas that is a strong mechanism, we should not wait just for the next FSNAU analysis for us to get into an assessment mode. And that is, I feel sometimes, a temptation we fall in on, that we just wait too long to go in with an assessment because we're waiting for that analysis that we actually so heavily rely upon in terms of having a prospect for instance, drought situation or even potential flooding, and that stops us from doing the actual work on the ground. So let me stop here, and happy to take any questions that may be there.
Many thanks, Peter. And indeed, the obstacles are really many in Somalia, and it is true, and we discussed that when we were with you in Somalia with the state team about the need to have a lean, flexible, and almost real-time tool to assess the situation and to complement those regular assessments. I think this is a good practice that it's worth mentioning. Now we are opening the Q&A session. The audience should really feel free to post questions. We already have a set of them. John, I would like to start with you. We have a rather interesting question, and that relates very much with another major theme of the Grand Bargain and the World Humanitarian Summit. It's about preparedness. We all know and agree that it is a critical means to respond in a more effective and efficient manner to a humanitarian crisis, whatever the crisis. But in the context of our conversation, is preparedness relevant?
Thank you, Giancarlo. Absolutely, of course. And we saw that most recently in the case of Hurricane Matthew in Haiti. It's absolutely essential that we are prepared and that we strengthen our response preparedness for the things that we can anticipate. And we did see very good work being done by our humanitarian colleagues in anticipating that there would be at some point a large hurricane and its devastating effects on Haiti. And what that then meant was that in preparing for that and having the assessments of the potential impact, we were then able to present this to the donors. And that then meant that the supplies and stocks that would be needed were anticipated, and in many instances they were already on location. So we saw, for example, very good work done by the World Food Programme. In their case, they had made the various assessments. They had convinced the donors of the necessity to have the food pre-positioned. And in that instance, it meant that the response then was immediate. So I think that we have to also see this whole issue in terms of not just responding after an event, but also equally important in doing the necessary assessments and analysis in anticipation, so that we are optimally prepared and in that respect have convinced our financial donors to have the necessary resources on hand to then be able to respond when the inevitable happens. Back to you, Giancarlo.
Thank you, John. Very to the point. Yes, so preparedness is really something that needs to be applied across the board, all through the humanitarian program cycle, and we indeed have here and there very good examples of such well thought preparedness. A rather different question, and turning to Peter. You mentioned the turf war, and it is true that HCTs really would need to have their collective vision and work together. So in a context of a war, that's a bit difficult, but I think we would never stress enough the need for an HCT to work together towards a common objective. But this being said, how did you handle these tensions, and what are the ways, a certain way to a bit, pacify the atmosphere and get, people working together for a common good? Peter.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. That's the question they always ask you when you apply for a job. It's obvious that you need to make sure that a lot of things are done jointly, that stovepiping doesn't happen in as much as possible, that the common structures you have are being used, but that also where necessary, a more individual approach as a humanitarian coordinator goes the way of an agency that feels very strongly about an issue and therefore may be at odds with other agencies. And there may be very valid reasons for that, but it is often worth, as a humanitarian coordinator, to take the time with an agency, sit down and to understand what is underlying their concern or their diverging position. And it's not just simply then bullying them into the fold, but it's understanding also what the very legitimate concerns of an agency may be. Of course, we do have, in Somalia, we've got, like everybody else, an HCT, but we also have a head of humanitarian agencies meeting that is a precursor to the HOHA, and where in a smaller UN forum, discussions are being ironed out, at least amongst UN agencies, so that they arrive then at the HCT with a common view, at least as far as the UN agencies are concerned. In terms of the cluster dynamics, there is a filter, of course, directly between the authority of the Humanitarian Coordinator and the clusters, which is the ICCG, and that has proven to be quite effective. And because we put the HCT and the ICCG together on a regular basis, that means there is a very clear guidance being provided to the ICCG, which oversees the cluster or coordinates the cluster, and the direct cluster interests. So I think we have a set of mechanisms. We also have a team that is very coherent. We have good bilateral mechanisms. We do get together regularly. We do have regular retreats. And that time that you take off from the operational reality often helps in terms of ironing things out, closing the door, saying some things to each other that may not be all too popular, and sorting it out. So it's a mixture of things that you utilize between mechanisms, more informal interactions, and basically giving agencies a chance to speak out and to give their concerns direct to the Humanitarian Coordinator where necessary.
Thanks, Peter. These are very wise words. Listening, promoting dialogue, and get together in a candid manner. That's for sure the initial step to get some, a better understanding and some harmony within the HCT and the ICCG. Thanks to the audience for submitting the questions. We are receiving quite many of them, and I have one that has been sent that is pretty interesting, and I'm a bit hesitating if maybe I will ask John and Peter to elaborate on that one. But the question is the role of the joint needs assessment vis-à-vis program-specific assessment that provides the more detailed information required for specific project design. Maybe we want to start with you, John, on that question. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Giancarlo. As I did say at the outset, the process of coming to this single coordinated assessment, the joint analysis, this can be fed by many different data collection processes. And again, it's all about the compatibility of the data. It's all about the consistency of the methodology that is used. And it's about transparency in sharing that source data. Because once that is done, then it's a contribution to the better understanding of the totality of the situation. You are going to have many necessary assessments by different organizations, and that's just the reality of the work that we do. But it's about not losing the value of those individual assessments as a contribution to a better collective and complete understanding of the whole situation. And that's why we acknowledge together that we still have a lot of work to do in our individual parts, but we have to also do that in a way and with a methodology and an approach and a transparency that contributes to the collective having that better understanding of the totality of the situation. So we feed in all these different contributions to that collective endeavor, and then we come up as a result with a better overall analysis, having the benefit of these different work streams that have been conducted for their own purpose, but because they're conducted in a way that has a common standard in terms of methodology, a common standard in terms of the quality of data, and a common standard in terms of the transparency where we have no issues with data collection. Let me just give you a practical example. I spoke positively about our experience in Haiti on the response preparedness side, where very good work was done to anticipate, and it mobilized donor resources as a result. But where we didn't do so well was when actually the crisis then hit, and in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, we were struggling as a community to agree on these protocols for the release of assessment data from the individual parts of our community to the entirety of our community. And that basically then delayed the completion of what was urgently required, which was a shared analysis of what has happened and therefore what we should be prioritizing in terms of the response. So that's why it's so important to get these systems into place where people just by default then get on with the job and share the data openly and transparently. Thank you. Back to you, Giancarlo.
Thanks, John. That was a very important clarification on the complementarity of the two approaches. Many thanks for that. Peter, we have a bit of a similar question. That is, in fact, what we're talking about is about balancing, UN agencies and INGOs that perform their own assessments and have their own approaches. How did you manage in Somalia, or how are you managing to bring this together?
Thanks. Again, it's a very bread and butter answer, very practical. I completely agree with John in terms of the importance of transparency. And transparency is not just amongst ourselves and with our sort of traditional donors, but also towards the authorities, both at the federal and sub-federal levels. I think that's where we are now in Somalia, and I think we can do this without major risks in most areas, I would say. So transparency, one. Two, flexibility. The importance of a coordinated approach, even if the other actors that we want to have as part of a coordinated effort are not necessarily putting their needs assessment and their subsequent programming as part of the Humanitarian Response Plan, like the Organization for Islamic Conference, very important partner, but they have their own way of working, they have their own areas of preference, but they sit in the HCT. So, we need to have the flexibility of working, even if we have an HRP, to work alongside partners that are not necessarily part of it, but that also provide a very important contribution into the humanitarian needs assessment and eventual response. And then three, of course, linked to that, the whole inclusivity in our approach is to, when we go on interagency missions, to ask the OIC and other Islamic NGOs if they're interested to come along, at least to reach out to them. That is really, really important, is that openness that leads to the inclusivity. So I would say those are the three elements to me that would help us balance the role of UN agencies against the INGOs, local NGOs, and the non-conventional partners. We do have, maybe as a last point, a very strong NGO, also an NGO consortium in Somalia, and the head of the NGO consortium is part of most of all the strategic efforts that we do undertake as an HCT. So, and also gets involved in the higher level strategic discussions that are around not only needs assessment but also response. So I think again that goes to the inclusivity, and we're just fortunate that we do have quite a cooperative spirit amongst the NGO consortium that pulls us closer together. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Very difficult to strike the right balance. That's a daily challenge for sure. We've received a another question from a colleague with a bit of humor on it, but I will read it as we received it. Does it mean that now we need to take a bus and travel all together to do a joint needs assessment? And it's a perception that is out there. Maybe John, you would like to address this question, but before you start, there is a lot of pressure on you both, John and Peter, because now the questions are flowing. So I would ask you to be as short as possible. Like this, we can cover the maximum number of these questions. Many thanks for your understanding. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Giancarlo. Well, if there's a lot of, definitely no, we shouldn't be going in a bus, because it should be possible for one person to have the questionnaire that will cover the information requirements that we have wherever possible. But as I said, it does feel like busloads of people are coming with their own series of questions to affected populations over a period of time, which leaves a big gap between their plight and the delivery of a response. And I think that is what we're trying together to fix, that we have less interventions, less intrusion in the lives of people who are affected from a questionnaire point of view, and a shorter gap between the time that they find themselves in need of assistance and are delivering that assistance. There's a serious question behind the joke on the bus, of course, and that is, is it just going to be one assessment? And I do want one message to come through in this webinar, and that is that no, it does not mean only one assessment. What it does mean is that when our community publishes an analysis of the needs in a given situation or country, we will have a comprehensive, joined up, single analysis of those needs. The source of information to enable us to come to a credible analysis of the situation will be the various assessments that are conducted within the different sectors and so forth. But in conducting those various assessments, we have to challenge ourselves. Do we really need all of us to go individually and ask the same people a series of different questions? Or could we not do better in terms of using a much more coordinated and joined up endeavor that will be less intrusive to those people and that will get the same result for the individual parts of our endeavor? So it's, please, let's work together to streamline the interventions, to lessen the interventions with the affected populations, but at the same time, let us also acknowledge that we are going to have different assessments conducted by different parts of our community at different times, and that's fine, as long as the data is usable by other parts of our community who don't have to go back and ask the same question again because we have a different methodology or a different approach. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. Another very important clarification. I would like to mention that we've opened the second poll. So if the audience can have a look at it, and again, it's very useful to us to improve on the quality of our webinars. I have now received a question around the resources that are needed to move forward the commitment from the grand bargain, and in particular the question relates to the resources that are required, and more specifically the ones that are required to integrate, you know, a sound gender analysis. So maybe Peter, you feel like taking this question over?
Yep, with pleasure. In terms of the gender perspective, for us, we are trying in Somalia to focus our whole being, I would say, and both the needs assessment in terms of also our implementation on the centrality of protection. So we are looking at particular elements that are inserted not just in the protection cluster, but throughout all the different interventions that we do that promote protection of particular groups that require, that even promotes particular focus on groups that do require. So rather than making this into sort of a specific set of interventions that you can then nicely sort of stovepipe into a into a cluster or a sector, we're trying to really build this in throughout, and we do provide either in the case of protection issues, the protection cluster, or in the case of gender, there is again a specific gender working group that provide direct, let's say, overview of not just the needs assessment, but also of the formulation then of the HRP, and make sure that in the HRP, the various cluster interventions are indeed focused towards either gender particular issues or protection particular issues. So this is the way we would go about it in Somalia. It's a fairly collective approach, well, it's this year for the first time that we're really going into this sort of centrality of protection, which then also links to the centrality of the whole gender issue. And we'll have to see if that really works out the way we intend it to be.
Okay, thanks a lot. And you've mentioned protection that often goes together with a sound gender approach. And I know many in the States team, and I'm sure in the audience that that these are really close to their heart in integrating correctly protection and gender. Many thanks for that, Peter. We are getting close to the end, and I have another question. And I know, Peter, that this is very, very close to your heart. It's about as a senior leader in the field, how easy it has been to bring together various actors, humanitarian, development, and political, and maybe what is for you in Somalia the next step to move this forward. Peter, I know it's very close to your heart. You have 1 minute for that. It's a bit of a trap, but I wanted to direct this question to you because I know that's your daily job. Over.
Fantastic. And if you give me 15 minutes, I'll fill it as well. But of course, we can't fool ourselves to think that the work we do is not political, even if we're humanitarians. Of course, it's extremely political. If we are looking at the underlying causes to humanitarian issues, and we want to resolve this in any possible way, whether it's displacement or even food security, if we don't look at the various political factors underlying the fact that there is displacement, that there is no proper prioritization of food security, we would not do a full job. So, to give you a very concrete example, now on the impending famine, we're putting together a high-level working group whereby we are looking at how all the different actors can contribute to the management of the drought situation, or at least not impede the response to the drought. And that means that you bring together a very sort of unusual bunch of people who, from various different angles, whether they are government, whether they are donors, whether they are businessmen, whether they are humanitarian actors, whether they are civil society organizations, they all have a certain role to play in terms of managing that humanitarian situation and contributing somehow to a solution that addresses some of the underlying causes. So it's these type of rather unusual initiatives that would allow you to look at the situation not just strictly from a stovepipe humanitarian point of view or even a solution point of view, but pull these things together. And we have piloted a number of approaches in Somalia around displacement, but now also we're going to open one on food security that indeed bring all these different aspects together, and for which we're very, very well equipped, and I think very well placed, even in terms of timing, how far we've come in terms of coming together and understanding each other as different actors, including, as I said, government and private sector being pulled into that to move forward. I could go on, but let me stop here.
Many thanks, Peter, and really I admire your restraint in responding to that question. So, dear colleagues, we've come to the end of this webinar. First of all, I would like to thank all of you who have joined us from different parts of the world. I hope you found the webinar useful and relevant to your work. With the state team and our panelists, we hope we have provided some practical and specific steps that you can tailor-made to your own operations. As we have heard from the panelists, getting joint needs assessment is possible. It requires leadership, at times courage, and striking the right balance to move forward with the HCT, the intercluster, and clusters at both central and decentralized levels. A particular thanks to the speakers, Peter de Cler, Deputy SRSG and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Somalia, and John Ging, Director of Operations in OCHA. Thank you both for your thoughtful approach and the real-life examples you shared with the audience. We will be sharing soon a summary of the key points. In addition, we would circulate the PowerPoint presentation together with some background documents that could be helpful for your work as you take over, hopefully, some key lessons and practical points. We've displayed the slide for more information because we unfortunately couldn't cover all the questions. So do not hesitate to use the resources available, and Agnès Dur from OCHA is available for addressing your questions. So thanks you very much and wish you all a very good end of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank